Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating the various building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. What do I mean with a planetary civilization? Well, I bluntly mean that we as the dominant species on the planet, we as humans, are called to become aware that ultimately we are the shepherds of all those sentient beings on the mother organism Gaia that we're called to steward for the many generations after us. Today's topic is reimagining mental health. So we will take a deep dive into the psychedelic ecosystem at large, which is very much at the core of my passion and my own healing journey, and then dive deeper into the future of workplace wellness. It's my great pleasure to be in that virtual room in between, I think, New York and Guatemala together today with Sherry Rais. She's the co-founder and CEO of Enthea, does amazing, really super important work, where I would say, where at the core of the podcast is always systemic change. I want to start on a slightly different plane. And let's see how that ties into the pivotal moments of Sherry once I lead over to her. In my own language, I would say expanding and healing yourself, your consciousness, without the use of sacred medicine, but also with the use of sacred medicine, I would say is a human right. And for whatever reason, the dominant cultural paradigm, certainly in the last, let's say, 500 years, has always tried to illegalize sacred substances. So, with few exceptions, sacred substances have been in use for many, many, many thousands of years. One example would be the use of psilocybin in magic mushrooms. Another pretty prominent example in the last, let's say, 25 years is ayahuasca, which is a brew made out of two different compounds and is generally used in, let's say, the Amazon basin. There are more plants and also other, let's say, synthetic compounds that have a proven track record in helping people to heal. And certainly, I personally have received that healing. So, the one piece in the podcast is scanning the psychedelic ecosystem. I'm super grateful, Sherry, that you're making yourself available, because my last scan of the psychedelic ecosystem in the podcast is somewhat 2 years ago, actually also with a good friend and anchor investor of yours. So having said all of that, like always in my podcast, for me it's always the human being first. I'm super curious, what made you the human being that you are? And usually I ask, Sherry, please sketch 2 or 3 pivotal moments in your biography that made you the human being that you are. The floor is yours. Super grateful to be in that virtual room with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to have deep dive into this conversation about psychedelics and consciousness with you. As for 2 or 3 pivotal moments that I think really shaped me, perhaps my answer might change depending on when you ask, but a few that come to mind are one, when I was in high school, I decided to do a school project on homelessness, and it was an independent project. It was in grade 10, I believe, so I would have been 15, and we were told to pick any topic we wanted and do a deep dive on that topic, and then present it to the class. And under no circumstance did the teacher ask me to do what I did, but I decided to, in order to understand homelessness, I wanted to sleep on the streets of Toronto, to actually feel what it meant to be homeless. So without my parents' permission, I decided to sleep on the streets of Toronto for just a couple nights. I was lucky that it was a temporary situation in my case, and talk to as many homeless people as I could. And I in this situation, actually did sleep on cardboard and had to beg in order to get money to eat. and talked to dozens of people and came away with the understanding that this situation is very much a mental health situation. And when we are quick to judge that some people that are in these situations, it's because they caused it to themselves, or it's their fault, they're lazy, or they don't want to work, that is very far from the truth. And so I think that is one of those pivotal moments that opened my eyes to the mental health crisis, that opened my eyes to how the systems are failing, and also for me created a strong sense of purpose in that I wanted to help people that were vulnerable. And actually, since then, I've spent a lot of time trying to help those that are unhoused, or different vulnerable communities. So that would be one. The second, and sorry that was a long one. I'll try to make the others shorter. The second is very difficult to summarize, but after high school, I took a gap year. Not something people do often in Canada or North America, but I decided to travel and volunteer. And part of that I spent in South America. And there was a small, at that time he was a kid, 11-year-old boy from Ecuador that I became very close to. He took part in a lot of the services where I was volunteering. I volunteered at a center for street children. And one of the pivotal moments was when he basically taught me that we shouldn't care so much about getting credit in life. And how he taught me that was, something happened and he worked very hard to get his mom a lot of gifts. He ended up performing, juggling on the street for months, day in and day out, and countless hours juggling on the street to buy all these presents for his mom for Mother's Day. And he sacrificed a lot to do that. And when we went to give the mom the presents, she assumed, because I was with him, that his, rich Canadian adult friend had probably paid for these presents. And I wanted to correct him, but my Spanish was not good enough at the time, like it is, perhaps now. I didn't know how to correct the mom and clarify. And he explained to me that this was God answering his prayers, because he wouldn't want his mother to know that his 11-year-old boy had to work so hard to buy her basic necessities. And that really opened my mind to, not wanting credit, but also that lessons can come from unexpected places. Like, here I was thinking I was coming to South America to help, these children in street children's centers. And this boy taught me one of my most valuable lessons. And the last one, I promise I'll keep it short because we have many things to talk about, but is maybe just a general moment, which are, all of the loving moments I've been able to share over the years with my family, in particular my dad and my brother, who I'm very close with and who I talk to every day. And that bond we share is extremely special, and I think it guides and shapes me in everything I do.
Yeah, lessons from unexpected places. What could be possibly be a better segue into the context of the psychedelic renaissance? I will leave it with how you would frame the psychedelic renaissance yourself, but I want to start before we dive into the regulatory challenges and the global developments with a personal story. So, luckily, I don't carry what you call developmental trauma. So, for the listeners, this basically means I was lucky to grow up in the family where I grew up. Abundant love, I have 2 siblings, I have my parents, and I even grew up with my grandparents. But I had a very early, pretty intense childhood accident. Very early, 2 years and 8 months. So you call that a shock trauma. And this had decades-long ripple effects, coping mechanisms. Mainly, I would say, pretty intense abuse on alcohol and marijuana that I picked up early in my teens, because I did not really learn how to self-regulate my nervous system. And I want to pick one prominent example. Even though it was illegal, in the year 2011. So I was already 32. I found a therapist who was a trained psychotherapist and did MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So MDMA, for those who don't know it, is usually, the rave drug, right? Like ravers take it, ecstasy. But basically the compound is the same thing. And I was invited to the session to lay down, be in silence. Just mute yourself, Sherry. Just mute yourself. That makes it easier. Cool. We'll have that cut out. So I was literally asked to lie there with a blindfold, some silent music in the background. And the only question the guy, it was a human being that I knew for quite a while, a close friend, asked me continuously, how did you feel before you burned your left upper leg at the age 2 years and 8 months old? And took me a while, and suddenly I had this big trauma breakthrough in one therapeutical session where I could reconnect through that wild child who was always climbing trees and not very good with authority and running around and lively. But I discovered that fountain of, let's say, pranic life force running through me without having the shadow of being afraid of hurting myself. So I'm just sketching that example as a felt life experience and a breakthrough in my own healing journey, supported by that substance MDMA, to segue into the regulatory challenges, where I think we will not only cover MDMA. Since you're way more proficient with all of that, let's dive into the regulatory challenges.
Okay, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with MDMA and what happened there?
Yeah, please, please.
Or maybe just as high level for those who don't know, there are many psychedelics that are out there in the world and in the forest and in the plants. But the ones that have perhaps gained the most amount of traction by the FDA are MDMA, which Alistair mentioned, also psilocybin, and also LSD. So these three have been given breakthrough status by the FDA and are in clinical trials. And then we have ketamine, which is already FDA approved as an anesthetic. But regulatory challenges is those three main psychedelics. None of them have been approved yet. They're in the process. And last August, the FDA decided not to approve MDMA. For me, this, and I think for most people that are in the space, we understand that this isn't really about whether or not it's going to be approved. It will be eventually. It's more of a case of when will it be approved. But it is important to understand where the hesitation came from. And so the FDA's hesitation with MDMA wasn't about whether or not it works. Clinical trials have shown absolutely remarkable efficiency. Nearly 2/3 of patients no longer meet PTSD criteria after treatment with MDMA. The real concern is about safety, scalability, and integration into the existing healthcare system. And I don't want to I want to say a little bit more if that's okay, Alistair. I would say with MDMA and psychedelics in general, there's a challenge that a lot of these substances, the therapy involves extended, multi-hour sessions with trained therapists guiding the experiences. And that's not like a traditional drug. It's not like most drugs you're prescribed and you take it home. Usually the FDA evaluates medications in isolation and not in like part of a structured therapeutic protocol. So this is a very big shift, and therefore it's not surprising that it's taking longer to get this FDA approval. And then also because you are spending so much time with your guide or with your therapist in a very neuroplastic state, there is an emotional bonding that occurs between the therapist and the patient. I don't know, Alistair, if you don't have to name the person that you worked with, but I'm sure you do remember their name, right? Or you bonded with them in some way. And so that phenomenon is usually called, transference. And it it's something that generally, when you're a psychologist, you learn like there are a lot of boundaries that you don't cross, and transference is really bad. But so regulators want to ensure that clinicians are properly trained, but there's this nuance that we have to deal with where with things like psychedelic therapy, there is more of a bonding experience that we have to acknowledge. And then there are tons of stigma. There's a lot of stigma and public perception and political considerations to think about when dealing with psychedelics. And I think that's also why there are some regulatory challenges, because the FDA, doesn't want to lose public trust, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think maybe this sprinkling in of personal examples to then have you give more of the both regulatory context as well as the global developments in different countries. I want to sprinkle in another one, which is not highly specific to my case, but I think everybody that watches the global news knows that the United States, especially in Canada, are in the heaviest opioid crisis ever, right? And more people die of opioids because of synthetic opioids. I won't dive too deep into the rabbit hole. I really think, I would say lifelong prison, if not, the death sentence, for the Purdue family is my personal heartfelt opinion. It's just an opinion, so you don't have to comment on that. But I want to go to one very specific compound in West Africa. So I did 4 initiations with Iboga, with the Mbwiti tradition. And it's a proven case that Iboga is the only compound known to the history of humanity that kind of breaks opioid addiction. And there are opioid clinics, specifically like in Mexico. And I'm very close to the founders, and I know the CEO of the Global Treatment Association of Iboga. And I just want to mention this because I did it really more out of curiosity. Because luckily, thanks God, because I had these addictive tendencies and noted them myself and got the feedback, let's say just alcohol and marijuana, never touched any psychedelic substance up until age 32, is I did Iboga out of curiosity, right? I did it in my shamanic training because I wanted to feel what is this master plan, what does it feel like? It was one of the most profound healing, less healing. I would say for me it was more a satori, a kensho, like an enlightenment experience. But when we talk about the broader context, and I know you're not a specialist on Iboga, I wonder if you could cite the other mentioned compounds. So MDMA, we have covered a little bit, but maybe could you cite some interesting findings, examples out of the possibilities to treat depression with psilocybin, or also the use of LSD in a let's say standardized setting, and what these studies show, which I think are all signs of hope.
Yes, happy to talk about that. So, I mentioned we are furthest along with, I would say, MDMA, LSD, and psilocybin. Ketamine, I'm saying already doesn't count because it's already FDA approved. There's studies being done with mescaline, ibogaine, and 5-MeO DMT as well. LSD is being looked at for anxiety. Psilocybin is being looked at specifically for many things, but furthest along for treatment-resistant depression. MDMA, which we already discussed a little bit, is being looked at for PTSD. Ibogaine is being looked at for substance abuse. But what's very exciting and what's coming out of these studies are, like you said, the efficacy rates. So with ketamine, actually, people don't think of ketamine as a treatment for addiction, but there is a study from University of Exeter that shows that people with alcohol addiction are 89% of them are abstinent at 1 year follow-up after ketamine assisted therapy, not ongoing ketamine for the rest of their lives, just a few sessions of ketamine therapy, and they're abstinent at 1 year follow-up. That's University of Exeter. There is another study with psilocybin and smoking cessation. And if you think about the trillions of dollars that smoking costs the global economy, this is, to me, very exciting news. Or if you know someone who has tried to quit smoking and hasn't been able to, which personally I know someone who's struggling a lot right now with that, or several people I know are struggling with that problem. And there's a study that showed 80% of people that completed psilocybin therapy that were, avid smokers. I forget if it was like smoking 10 cigarettes a day or a pack of cigarettes a day for several years, but 80% of them were able to quit smoking either at 6 month or 1 year follow-up. Then I'm going to brag a little bit about Enthea's study or data with our own members with ketamine as well. We've seen that over 80% of people are no longer on their antidepressants, even at 3 month follow-up after ketamine therapy. So imagine being on antidepressants for years and years and years and not feeling like you're getting better, and finally having that breakthrough. And then not to too much go on and on, but there's really exciting applications of these psilocybin, again, for treatment of eating disorders. I don't remember offhand the statistic on LSD's efficacy for anxiety, but I know it's very effective for anxiety. And you mentioned the opioid crisis. People are looking at actually these substances to help treat people that are addicted to opioids, and they're seeing tremendous success, anywhere between 70 and 80% abstinence as well. So I think there's a lot here in treating a wide variety of conditions. And we have several different drugs in the pipeline. And it tells us that, there's hope for the up to 60% of people with mental health conditions that are suffering. There's actually hope. And I think that's the most exciting part about all of this.
Yeah, I wanna segue into the next part of the conversation. Absolutely, signs of hope. Within the, let's say, short-lived lifetime of myself, of having done in a pretty controlled setting, profound breakthroughs, both from my addictive tendencies. And I know alcohol is a tough one, even though I was never a hard alcoholic. I was a classical house music, party, booze in a club guy. But to get really rid of that was a long journey, actually. I want to segue into the global development. So what are the signs in the global arena where we can learn from pioneering countries and sense again signs of hope?
Okay, there's a ton here. So, one, Australia, first country to allow psychiatrists to prescribe MDMA and psilocybin for PTSD and depression. That sets a precedent for medicalized access. It sets a example for the world. They still have challenges like costs and provider access and insurance barriers, but the fact that Australia opened the doors in that way, is really great. Two, Canada, my home country, has taken a more compassionate access approach, allowing psychedelic therapy to be provided to people on a case-by-case basis. So Australia said, okay, yeah, free reign, kind of psychiatrists can prescribe MDMA and psilocybin. Canada said, we will look at it case by case, but we will approve it, especially for end-of-life anxiety and treatment-resistant conditions. So the model in Canada is prioritizing patient needs. It can be kind of feel inconsistent or unfair in implementation because it's still challenging to get. And then Switzerland has allowed limited. I think I could be mistaken on this, so I should fact check myself at some point. But first of all, Switzerland has a long history with psychedelic research and therapy. If people don't know, this is kind of where LSD was sort of found. But I believe that now there are a few psychiatrists that have been given permission to prescribe psychedelics in their practice to use with therapy and use psychedelic-assisted therapy. But I can't remember if it has to be part of a trial or a research setting or not, but I feel like it's not. I could be wrong. I would say the takeaway from the above mentioned countries is that change is possible. There are different models to do this. You know, some places are prioritizing access, others are prioritizing maybe research more. And we can learn from these approaches. But I also want to mention, Alistair, if I may, that aside from these medical models, there are ceremonial practices which you mentioned in the intro of this podcast, that we can't forget about, that really we really need to learn from these ceremonial practices, in particular in Africa and Latin America. Like countries like Peru, Brazil, Colombia have deep traditions of psychedelic plant medicine, particularly with ayahuasca. And the practices in Latin America have emphasized community, spirituality, ancestral wisdom. So it's very different than the Western medical model, but still something we need to learn from, because they have a much longer track record. We've been doing this for, let's say, 60 years.
Yeah,
They've been doing it
please.
for thousands of
Let's
years.
let's stay there. I'm really so grateful that you're making yourself available. So let's talk about the two settings that I know.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, for me, with that specific case of shock trauma, I definitely always say I overdid ayahuasca. And I had many years where I didn't touch ayahuasca. But one of the most profound healing experiences in my life was to work with the sacred cactus. So there's actually two different cacti. One is called San Pedro and the other one is called peyote. They have a slightly different, let's say, mix of psychedelics, but I would say they're pretty similar. It's my personal opinion. I know there's people who disagree. So anyhow, I've mainly worked with peyote in the classical setting of Virarica ceremony. So the books of Carlos Castaneda, when they were written and became famous, that's all written from the tradition of the Virarica. That's the name they give themselves. And the Spaniards gave them the name Huichol, which is more commonly known, but it's actually exactly the same tribe. And I've not done many ceremonies in the last 9 years with them, let's say under 20, I don't know, 12, 15. But the most profound was the first one. Mainly because with one relapse in alcohol, it was before going into the ceremony, I committed to completely quit smoking a package of cigarettes a day, my party hedonistic relationship with alcohol and marijuana. And again, with one relapse, 7, 8 years ago, I'm now 10 years sober. And the interesting thing in the community setting, you always say it's setting doses. It's not only the psychedelic compound itself. It's such a profound healing experience to pray together around the fire and sing around the fire whilst, let's say, your ego boundaries are loosened. Whereas I would say specifically for mescaline, which is the psychedelic compound in the already mentioned two cacti, peyote or San Pedro, in that specific tribalistic setting, I would not say it's really psychedelic unless you go very high dose. It's actually very warm and embracing and a very beautiful feeling. So I think we have covered quite a bit about the global developments in the different countries and the protection of the sacred use in a traditional indigenous setting, which are different laws governing that, and a whole separate roster of conversations I already covered on that. So I want to come to the cultural shift. So I'm mainly interested when you look at the global news media outlet and famous people and podcasts, like what has changed in the last few years? What's the cultural shift behind the, psychedelic renaissance?
Oh my gosh. The mainstream conversation has completely transformed in the last few years. Because of Michael Pollan, first the book How to Change Your Mind, then obviously the Netflix special, and then I would say Joe Rogan's podcast, and then tons of celebrities that have come out talking about their use of psychedelics. People like Aaron Rodgers, Prince Harry, Lamar Odom, Mike Tyson, Gwyneth Paltrow, I think the list goes on, coming out and talking about their use. There's this massive shift where stigma is reduced, curiosity is there. What was once seen as like a fringe sort of taboo thing is now seen as, oh yeah, I saw that on 60 Minutes. I saw that in the New York Times. I saw it in Wall Street Journal. Like there's this mainstream media coverage, and people feel, I think, even people who are more open or curious maybe internally about psychedelics but ashamed to say it, now they can say it because they can package it with like, oh yeah, I watched that documentary, right? Like there is a science to this, or there's public acknowledgement of this. And so even at Enthea, I'm talking to employers every day. And when we started Enthea, we thought this is going to be very tough. It's going to be very difficult talking to employers about psychedelics. And initially, those conversations were very tough. Like, we never even mentioned the word psychedelics. But now we go into rooms and we talk to employers, large employers, and they've heard of this. They want to know how the science works, they want to know the research, of course. But that first step, that first battle is sort of already done for us, because there is that openness, there is that change in the culture. And I think I'll add to that, Berkeley, I'm very bad with remembering all the acronyms, like Center for Psychedelic Science, I could be wrong of the exact acronym, did a really great survey to measure public perception around psychedelics. And again, apologies for getting the exact number wrong, but it was like a majority, definitely over 50%. I want to say close to 65% of people said they thought that psychedelics should be legal. So it's like a overwhelming majority of voters in this survey that Berkeley published said that they've not only heard of psychedelics, they don't think they should be illegal. So yeah, things have definitely shifted. I think a couple of years ago, last thing I'll add is like the cover of Sports Illustrated was dominated by psychedelics. So like, we're living in different times now.
Yeah, I want to quote Peter Drucker, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? It's just a fact. So I would say science is on the side that it's not a question if, but when certain psychedelics for certain use cases in a certain setting will for sure be legal. If that takes another 4 years or 8 years or 12-year cycle, and then the global adoption, depending on the different, let's say, cultural paradigms, depending on the regions, but it's just a matter of time, and culture changes. I want to dive into market dynamics and frame that a little bit. So I'm a trained macroeconomist. I work in investing. I see it with, in Germany, you say one laughing and one crying eye. Because fact is, it's actually good that some things can't be patented or trademarked, right? Psychedelic mushrooms, to produce them doesn't cost a thing. You can order, a box, and produce kilograms of mushrooms for $50, and then provide basically the whole city quarter with magic mushrooms. So that's the, I don't know, hippie born rebel child. But obviously, I also understand the rationale of for purpose, for profit, that you need to make a profit. And also, ideally, big fan of controlled settings. Actually, my main healing, I think, was the sum total that I really had the psychotherapists that were trained, and also knew sometimes, Alistair, I recommend you don't do ayahuasca at all, for a couple of years. Just do that one therapeutical, let's say, wave, And so all I'm saying is I'm not against regulation, I'm not against a controlled setting, but there are also certainly critical pieces, where psychedelics become mainstream. So I wonder what you have to say on the more critical part to then really segue into Enthea, your theory of change, your business model, and where you're standing.
Sorry, so just to repeat the question, you want to know about the critical part of market dynamics? Just so I'm
Yeah,
understanding your question.
please. Yeah,
question.
please. What's your take? I mean, I'm a very critical person, right? Is like, do you see some tendencies with a critical eye on the, let's say, commercialization of psychedelics in the marketplace? And then obviously, please also cite some positive examples before we dive right into Enthea.
Yes. Okay. So, I guess I always see things in a very optimistic way. And I was just listening to a podcast that talked about like one of the key determinants of a founder's success is like definitely always believing like everything's gonna work out. So it's hard for me to put on my critical hat, but I will do it. Um, and perhaps people won't agree with me on this. One, when we talk about kind of actually regulatory things as well as commercialization, one of my concerns is when we start decriminalizing or legalizing uh, a lot of these psychedelic substances and making them available for recreational use without a medical or ceremonial container. I worry about the risk of misuse, the risk of addiction, the risk of adverse effects. Um, and I really do worry that doing this might take us backwards, like kind of what happened, in the 60s before the Renaissance that we are in now. And I know saying this, not everyone agrees with me, and it's a little bit controversial or hypocritical because you mentioned that you didn't have like so much crazy diagnosable depression, but you've benefited from these, accessing ayahuasca or MDMA therapy. And me too, I know so many people that have benefited from the underground or even recreational use, if I'm being honest, people who took psilocybin in a recreational setting, but then had a transformative spiritual experience that then, put them on this whole new path. And yet, saying all of that, I do worry because there are campaigns in many places to decriminalize and legalize these substances, and it's a very difficult topic because I see the benefit of that, but I also have a lot of concerns. Ketamine is a really good example here. Ketamine in recreational settings can be an addictive substance, and I'm not excited to share that because I am trying to convince employers that they should give their employees ketamine therapy. But we do have data that tells us that when used in recreational settings, ketamine can be addictive. We also know that when used in clinical settings, ketamine is actually not addictive. Many studies have showed that the effect is almost negligible. And so it's a really good example of I'm such an advocate of ketamine therapy and people having access to this for their mental health. And I know people who have benefited from it in even recreational settings. And yet I worry about it becoming too available such that, we start having adverse effects and addiction problems. So
Yeah,
I don't know if
please.
that fully.
No, please.
Yeah.
Let me tie into that, and then
Yeah.
let's dive deep into Enthea. So,
Yeah.
and I will give the two classical examples that I always tell people. So, if it's close friends or business partners, or literally just a human being I meet in a cafe, I'm always like very upfront how I perceive people. So I always tell people, if you have never done psychotherapy and you have real issues in your life, go to a trusted psychotherapist that helped hundreds of people, right? It's not the same like reading a self-help book. The same is true when people recreationally have experience with psychedelics, right? And many of them, type Burning Man, right, feel like, to me, super inflated egos, where I tell them, sweetheart, if you go into a 10-day shamanic setting with a Shipibo shaman, that's ideally 2 generations older than you and that has hosted thousands of ceremonies, the likelihood that that guy will crush and grind your ego down is at least way more likely. So I'm a big fan of always combining, let's say, the lineage holders of certain traditions with an enlightened Western approach. So if you grind down your ego in the Shipibo setting and you still have issues like I had, may be good to complement them, with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, or at least, a therapist that also knows the experience you have underwent. I think that's a good segue. What is Enthea? What was the genesis? And yeah, what's the overall theory of change? You're trying a really big lift. I feel you have tailwind. What's actually the genesis? When was it like Sherry has this like, this is what I want to do, and I'm going to stick to it up until it's successful, and if it takes 10 or 12 or 15 years?
Wow. Okay. Let's dive into all of this. So, we didn't talk too much about my career before Enthea, but in a nutshell, as it pertains to, what is Enthea, I spent just over a decade working on poverty reduction and lived and worked in some of the world's poorest countries. And in that experience, was confronted with the global mental health crisis and just how bad it is and how much it affects people. And as I, went up, I guess, the ladder, you can say, in my career in international development work, I started to have the capacity to affect change. I was designing and implementing programs. They were large scale. I had influence, with people in very senior political positions. And I was passionate about mental health, but I couldn't find solutions. So I was so excited that I might be able to affect change, and I was doing this work that was very rewarding, and I was trying to reduce poverty, and I was sort of seeing this connection between poverty and mental health. And so I put on my problem solving hat of, okay, how do we address the mental health issue? And then that excitement kind of died down because I just saw how traditional methods to treat mental health aren't very effective. There's, huge failures with our current mental health system. And then I, persistent as I am, did more digging, kept Googling, and eventually all of that digging led me to more innovative treatments. And I stumbled upon, this was just like while I was living in Africa, on my laptop, stumbled upon more innovative treatment methods like psychedelic-assisted therapy and ketamine-assisted therapy, and started seeing all of this amazing data that we've talked about in terms of efficacy rates around these things. And the immediate question was like, okay, why aren't we doing this? Why isn't this available? Okay, there's some regulatory challenges, which we've talked about. But what about ketamine? This is available. This is an FDA-approved thing. So why is this not available? Oh yeah, there's some stigma and insurance doesn't cover it. And so people have to pay out of pocket. And people don't really talk about how effective it is. And so it's hard to find a ketamine therapist. And so essentially Enthea was birthed out of this problem that traditional methods to treat mental health are not working for a lot of people. There are effective methods that are out there that get to the root cause of mental health, not just psychedelics. Psychedelic is part of that. And unfortunately, these things are not accessible and not affordable. And so Enthea is here to solve that problem and make these treatments available. And we're doing that first through employers in the US, through sort of insurance access and reimbursement. And the idea behind that is, if you zoom out, actually it's very perfect. We talked about, this is what Australia is doing, and this is what Switzerland is doing, and this is what Canada is doing. And all of those are great. But if we're being honest about the market, it's a slow process. I'm really great that those things are in place. but I do think if ketamine therapy or psychedelic therapy became the norm as a workplace benefit, if everyone that had a job in the US thought that, getting access to effective mental health treatments was as standard as getting access to dental benefits, then that would create a paradigm shift in the world. And that's why I'm so passionate about Enthea,
I
and that's
love
why
it.
I'm
No,
willing
no,
to.
no. I mean, there's a reason why I'm doing the podcast with you, because the trained macroeconomist loves your theory of change, right? Because even though the word lever and scale is heavily abused in the, let's say, neoliberal paradigm, I have no idea, but let's say it's a couple of 100 million people in the US that are employed. And obviously, if you're given the access and it's paid for and you suffer a clinical depression, this costs your employer a hell lot of money. And the efficacy of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is way more efficient for the employer and saves the insurance company and then the reinsurance company a lot of costs. I really love your theory of change. To dive deeper, when was the genesis? What were the first steps? And where do you see currently the traction?
Okay, Genesis started as ideas in 2019, registered as a nonprofit initially in 2020, and the initial groundwork that was laid, or the foundation, even when we were a nonprofit, was to build standards of care and medical policies. So we had to think, if we're going to offer this benefit, if you think about, just to make the comparison, if you have dental insurance, right, there are all these policies like what's covered, what's not covered, what's the process of getting braces or a root canal, and all of these things. And there's all these codes for the different treatments. Well, this doesn't exist for ketamine assisted therapy, for example, because no one has covered it. So we had to build all of that. And then we had to, again, going back to the dental example, if you have dental insurance, it's kind of useless if you have a pamphlet that says, your braces are covered and your root canal is covered, but this is not covered. It's very useless if you don't have any dentists in your network, right? Like if you don't have anyone to go to and you just have a pamphlet that says that this is what we cover, but there's only one dentist in the country, it's sort of useless. So then the other part of the groundwork was building a network of providers. And in order to build a network of providers, we had to come up with a process of vetting them, of credentialing and figuring out who is the best. How do you determine who is the best provider? And so we had to convene panels, expert panels, people who are, experts in their field and have done the research and are practicing ketamine therapists, but have been doing it for a long time. And we convened many times to kind of figure out, okay, well, what do you think makes for the best ketamine therapist? So that was sort of the groundwork, those policies and processes that we put together, and then the building of the network. And I think your next question was sort of and then, so I said we started as a nonprofit, and then we also then realized we had to scale, and we needed more funding in order to scale. So then we created a public benefit corporation in order to raise investor capital, and we're able to raise some money in our seed round in 2022. And we kept the nonprofit, by the way, because we thought we could keep this as like a patient assistance fund, to be able to treat people from underserved communities. And then you asked about like the traction, and oh my God, I can't stop talking about the traction. It's so exciting. Like we've talked about how there's been shifts in the culture. People are now more open to this. And COVID happened, and COVID really affected depression and anxiety, went through the roof. Burnout went through the roof. There was the great thing where everyone was quitting, the great resignation, they called it, when everyone was quitting their job. And so because of COVID, 6 out of 10 employers in the US invested in new mental health solutions, which is great. However, all of the recent, like SHRM, which is the leading organization in HR globally, all of the reports show that even though companies have invested in mental health solutions, employees are not happy with their mental health benefits because they're getting access to more of the same traditional treatments that aren't helping them. So it's great that companies are investing in this, but employees are not getting better. And so they're still, ending up in the ER, they're still not productive, they're still calling in sick because of mental health issues. And so the traction we're seeing now, it took a few years to get here, is that now companies are like, oh my God, we need something that actually works. And so we have gone from, a couple years ago, 2 years ago, when you had your last psychedelic guest on your podcast, who happens to be an investor in Enthea, Marique from Taboo, we had 500 people in America covered by our plan, which is like an employee benefit plan. And now we have 250,000 people covered. So I would say there's been a lot of traction.
Let's do the math. Let's do the math, because every investor wants the hockey stick. But from 500 to 250,000. I'm repeating to the listeners, from 500 to 250,000. I would say that's a pretty substantial hockey stick, right?
Yeah.
Where specifically in the space, in the hockey stick, is there any tendency towards certain compounds, like the ketamine thing? Where do you sense in the, let's say, strategic partnerships you're forging is the best argument to switch, if you take the hat from your, let's say, client side, from the employer side?
Yeah. So right now Enthea offers ketamine-assisted therapy, something called stellar ganglion block, which we don't have time to get into, like the details of what that is, but it's another treatment. TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation, and we do offer psilocybin in Oregon. But we've invested the most in ketamine-assisted therapy, and we're seeing the most traction with ketamine-assisted therapy because, we spend a lot more time selling that, to be honest, because we really believe in it. And we have the data to show how effective it is. Not that the other things don't work, but it was our first product, so to speak. And from the customer hat, like, why are they buying into this? Well, one, for every 100 employees a company has, they're spending $150,000 a year, or they're losing $150,000 a year for every 100 employees due to untreated mental health. That's if you combine the direct healthcare spend as well as the productivity losses. 60% of missed work days are actually due to mental health, as well as the retention losses, so the cost of rehiring. So 150 grand for every 100 employees. And what we're offering is something that can actually, lead to outcomes that help them reduce those costs, hopefully reduce them quite significantly. And then a more direct savings, which is very interesting from the customer perspective, is they are paying for and covering Spravato, which is the branded version of ketamine. And the branded version of ketamine costs $45,000 a year, up to $45,000 a year. And it's something you take year after year after year. And so from an employer's point of view, if they have even just one person who is on Spravato, who can switch to generic ketamine, which is negligible in cost, just the ketamine is very cheap. And then if you add the therapy, average ketamine-assisted therapy protocol is $5,000 or $6,000. There's like an immediate savings right there. Like, do I want to spend the 45 grand a year for this Spravato and they're not actually getting much better? Or do I want to spend the 5 grand? And
Let me tie into that.
Yeah.
I mean, even though I also, have a critical hat, it's always good to catch the people with the money, right? I mean, you just save tons of costs and you have the efficacy on your side. I would say we're in a good moment to use the Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework. In almost all the podcasts, I'm using that. So when you look at Enthea, and let's say the tendencies in the market at large, what do you think will happen in a Horizon 1? The next 1 to 2 years, to then take a deeper look into maybe 5 and then latest like 10 years. But let's start with the immediate things you want to accomplish and where you see the market moving.
Okay. So, immediate things to accomplish. Actually, my goal for this year was for 2025, for the end of it, was the 250,000 people covered. And I guess we we hit the goal already. But for the first 12 months, it's really increasing access to ketamine assisted therapy and stellar ganglion block. And it's great that you know, 250,000 people have access to it, but I would like to see at least over 10,000 people actually get treated. So there's people who have access, but then there's how many people actually get treated, and I'd like to see over 10,000 people actually get treated. Then I want to say that our next big goal for this year is really signing more unions. So we've been really focused on working with unions, specifically in blue collar industries like construction and building trades and electricians, because of the very high rate of mental health issues. Just as a, you know, high level thing, the highest rate of suicide is in the construction industry. 25% of all opioid deaths in America are from the construction industry. And so this year I'm really focused on like continuing to help the people that need it the most. Like, I'm very excited about the potential of signing on like all the cool tech companies that everyone can imagine are like, you know, forward thinking and progressive. But you know, maybe I'll do that next year. This year I'm like, let's help the people that need it the most. So that's horizon one, short-term goals. And then last part of the goal, so the, you know, getting on more employers, expanding access, more people treated. And then I think, you know, just continuing to educate, as even though the culture has shifted, especially in these blue collar industries, there is still a lot of stigma around mental health. And so addressing stigma and educating people is our job, and we don't take that lightly.
Before we dive into the Horizon 2, let's say midterm aspirations, what I sense and wanted to mirror you live in the podcast is really your love and compassion for the underprivileged. Because the logical thing, you know, maybe, you know, like, let's go to the big tech companies. And sure, they may also have issues, but that you really serve on those who suffer the most from the opioid crisis and the high suicide rates. I just wanted to mirror that. I find that really, really touching and actually very human. I work the same. Midterm aspirations. So, okay, you lift all of that and more of that, and you have the tailwind, and you have the new administration, which I reckon will also be very beneficial, at least for the US context of your platform and the whole psychedelic ecosystem. What do you sense in the, let's say, next 3 to 5 years? I think that's a crystal ball, you know,
Yeah.
that we can still like try to estimate.
Okay. And before, just so I'm clear, I'll get to answer long term too, right? Because I also have some even longer than five
No,
years. Okay.
midterm. I mean, that's kind of what you can sense as a founder, growing the
Yeah,
company, more
yeah,
widespread adoption, cultural shift, you know, deepening.
yeah. Yeah, so midterm aspirations would be one, obviously it doesn't depend on Enthea, but definitely we would like to see other psychedelics like MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD become FDA approved and then integrated into all of our plans. So I would love that. And then as we see evidence for, you know, other treatments, maybe even that are not psychedelic, that are FDA approved, you know, integration of new treatments, innovation, really, so that we can help people and give them a wide variety of options. So that's one. Two, you know, the short term was like partnering with more unions and employers, but the midterm is really partnering with the large insurance companies. So if we really want to help the, you know, hundreds of millions of people that live in the US, we need to do it through the big insurance carriers. And so those insurance partnerships, us partnering with, you know, like the Anthem and the Blue Cross and the Kaisers and the United, would set the way there. And then Also, in midterm, I would like to see that all of this revenue that we're getting, because we're growing and we're very successful, and all of this revenue is coming in, is then a part of it is channeled to our nonprofit, which then allows us to treat people, like I said, from underserved communities who don't have access to insurance or employee benefits, whether they are unhoused or on Medicaid, or perhaps incarcerated, or have just come out of being incarcerated. So really trying to help people that come from these more vulnerable communities. And then last thing is the midterm aspiration is expansion into nearby markets. I have more international goals as well, but midterm would be, looking into expanding. I'm Canadian, so of course I think about expanding into Canada and perhaps Europe as well.
And now the big crystal ball. I really personally love the big crystal ball, and I have my own opinion, but I'm just a host in the podcast, so I don't even know your age. Dash younger, 10 years younger, something like that. I'm mid-40s. So you're wildly successful. The regularly burdens are relieved. You have the first big insurance companies hop on the train. We're in, let's say maybe, I love the magic 7. We're like, let's say in 2032 to 2035, 7 to 10 years into the future. How do you sense that?
Okay, so I'm so happy you asked. First of all, thanks for the compliment. I'm only a few years younger than you, I think. But long-term crystal ball, psychedelic therapy and other innovative mental health treatments that are effective, that get to the root cause, is the norm. People have access to treatments that work, and they no longer have to numb the pain and mask symptoms with, a bunch of pills that aren't actually helping them. And so, globally, people have access to treatments that work. They're educated about it. There's no stigma about it. Not just psychedelics, just treatments in general that are effective, that get to the root cause. People know about them. They can talk about them. They have access to them. They're affordable. And I'm not so crazy to think that Enthea can, do all of this, but I do think we can play a really important role in this domino effect, or like this ripple effect of making that happen. And I really would like to see everything that Enthea does in the next, 5 to 7 years set the way for countries all over the world to see an example of how this can be replicated. I mean, if Enthea can help replicate it, of course, I'm very passionate about doing work in low-income countries, but sharing our data, sharing our models, sharing our standards, sharing it with the world so that they can do it too, is what I'd like to see. And is like a number that I actually always think about is 1 billion people changed by treatments that work. Like that's, if I think about how many people are affected by mental health in the world today, they say it's 1 billion people. So I want 1 billion people to be helped. So that's the goal, long term.
I use the same number. And I think
1
it's
billion.
totally realistic. The next 7 to 10
Yeah.
years, 1 billion people get educated, access in the right setting, doses, with the right preparation and integration to receive deep healing. And I love that you're saying through psychedelics and other innovative efficacy, efficacious ways to heal. I have nothing to add. What are my closing words? Let's. I did it yesterday. I was recording a podcast yesterday. So let's close both maybe with a short prayer. You're happy. You're welcome to reciprocate. I wish that in the next 7 to 10 years, 1 billion people on the planet can receive as much or even more healing than I have personally received. I had only my breakthrough in trauma therapy 8 years ago when I was 37, and the amount of life force, traction, grounding, love, abundance, coherence, creativity that I can unlock through that vessel, that like flesh-made, bone-made human vessel that is called Alistair. I really wish that to all these other sentient beings out there who suffer severely, much like I suffered, and many suffer way more and are not as privileged as myself. I would say that's my closing prayer. Thanks for the conversation, and happy to hand over to you for some closing words or maybe also a short prayer, whatever you feel like.
Thanks. I think to complement what you just said, which I very much agree with, I would like to just call people back to the present. I'm like a dreamer, and I get very excited about the future and the billion people that could be helped. But you know, this isn't just about the future. This everything is happening now, and so I think I'd like to invite everyone to be a part of it. You don't have to be a healthcare professional or an entrepreneur or an investor. Just if you're listening and you care about humans and you care about healing, you can get involved in this universe, like starting now. And so that's my invitation more than anything.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks so much for this beautiful deep dive conversation.